of the House of Commons Standing Committee of Official Languages. The committee is meeting on its study on the annual report 2019 and 2020 of the Commissioner of Official Languages and the main estimate 2020 and 2021 pursuant to the order of reference of September 30, 2020. The proceeding will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Pour celles et ceux qui participent.
For those participating virtually to the meeting, members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. At the bottom of your screen, you have the choice between floor, English, or French. Before speaking, click on the microphone icon to activate your own mic. When you're done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should members need to request the floor outside of their designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to intervene on a point of order that has been raised by another member, they should use the raised hand function. This will signal to the chair your interest in speaking, and your name will be added to the speakers list. In order to do so, you should click on Participants at the bottom of the screen. And when the list pops up, you will see next to your name that you can click Raise Hand.
Slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Unless there are exceptional circumstances, the use of the headset with a boom microphone is mandatory for everyone participating remotely. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise the chair. Please note that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure all members are able to participate fully. With regard to the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can, maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. Madame la greffière, à ce stade-ci,
I would now like to ask the clerk if we have any substitutes for today's meeting. Yes. Just 1 second, please. We have Mr. Major, who's replacing Mr. Williamson. We have Mr. Housefather replacing Ms. Lambropoulos, and Mr. Drouin replacing Mr. Duguid. Thank you. So I would now like to warmly welcome our witnesses. We are delighted to be meeting with you. So we have with us today, first of all, Mr. Raymond Théberge, Commissioner of Official Languages, Mr. Pierre Leduc, Assistant Commissioner, Policy and Communications Branch, Ms. Ghislaine Secley, Assistant Commissioner, Compliance Assurance Branch, Mr. Éric Trépanier, Assistant Commissioner, Corporate Management Branch. And we also have with us Maître Pascal Giguère, General Counsel, Legal Affairs Branch. The Commissioner will make a statement at the beginning of the meeting addressing both the annual report and the main estimates. Questions for the first hour of our meeting should be dedicated to the annual report, and questions for the second hour should be dedicated to the main estimates. This summer, I had the opportunity to speak with the Commissioner, but today we have the pleasure to welcome you here before the Standing Committee on Official Languages. So, Mr. Theberge, you have the floor for the next 10 to 15 minutes. You have the floor.
We're meeting today on a virtual platform. I would like to acknowledge that I'm addressing you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm pleased to be connecting with you today in your various territories and communities.
Excusez-moi,
Oui.
Monsieur le Commissaire.
Excuse me, Commissioner. We're having a minor technical problem. I'm told that we're having some difficulty with Mr. Beaulieu and Madame Ashton, who has just joined us. With your indulgence, we will take a short break and come back in just a few moments. It shouldn't take very long. I will suspend then, therefore, for a few minutes. Thank you. Now let us resume. And my apologies, Mr. Theberge, for having interrupted you. So you can begin again as you wish. So over to you, Mr. Theberge. Thank you, Chair. Bonjour.
Meeting today on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge that I'm addressing you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm pleased to be connecting with you today in your various territories and communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed so many aspects of our work and the way we interact with each other. I hope to be able to meet with you all in person in the not too distant future. I see many familiar faces on the committee, as well as some new members. I'd like to recognize all the hard work this committee has done in the past and underscore the importance of your work at what is, now more than ever, a critical time for official languages in Canadian society. I'm appearing before your committee to present my 2019-2020 annual report, discuss our upcoming projects, and share the highlights of the 2021 main estimates for my office. Joining me today are my three assistant commissioners, Ghislaine Séclé, Pierre Leduc, and Éric Trépanier, and my general counsel, Pascal Giguère. À titre de commissaire aux langues officielles, je suis chargé de représenter les communautés.
As Commissioner of Official Languages, I have the responsibility to represent official language minority communities throughout the country. It has been my honor to carry out this role for nearly 3 years now. My mandate thus far has not been uneventful. We've marked the passage of the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act, and even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a worrying trend of erosion of support for official language minority communities across Canada. Decisions that governments at all levels make with respect to official languages have a real impact on Canadians' daily lives. I continue to hear their stories through the complaints that I receive and when I speak with the various associations across the country. In 2020, it is undeniable that Canadians face some real challenges in exercising their fundamental rights. These include the right to receive services from the federal government, the right to vote, and the right to receive safety-related information in their preferred official language. And Canadians are taking notice of these lapses in respect to their rights. In the past year alone, complaints to my office have risen by 25%.
Annual report, which I tabled in September, I presented 3 main reasons why Canadians' language rights are not being respected. The Official Languages Act is outdated. Federal institutions are not complying with the Official Languages Act, and the government is not doing enough to promote both official languages across Canada. I issued 3 recommendations to the Prime Minister to address these problems. In one of those recommendations, I reiterated the essential need for the Official Languages Act to be modernized so that it is relevant for today's society, so that it can adapt in step with change, and so that it provides proper enforcement tools. Les communautés de langues officielles en situation minoritaire, les parlementaires,
Significant efforts have been made by official language minority communities, parliamentarians, my office, and the federal government itself to consult Canadians on the modernization of the Act. Expectations are high. For my part, I expect the federal government to give due attention to the 18 recommendations I issued last year. These recommendations were informed by our consultations with Canadians and the experience my office has gained in overseeing the Act for over 50 years now. Modernizing the Official Languages Act in a meaningful way is about respecting Canadians' fundamental language rights now and in the future. In my annual report, I also recommended that the Prime Minister address systemic problems in federal institutions that limit Canadians' ability to exercise their language rights, and to step up efforts to promote the importance of both English and French in Canada for all Canadians.
Has merely amplified ongoing problems both within the public service and more widely in Canadian society. My recent report on official languages in emergencies sheds light on the existing shortcomings in respecting Canadians' language rights and ensuring their safety during crisis situations. One of the most striking examples is the dissemination of alert messages only in English. If a person is not able to understand the information that is being passed on to them, how can they ensure their safety? I believe that Canadians should receive alert messages in both official languages at the same time, anytime, and anywhere in order to protect their safety. Press conferences taking place in only one language, information material shared in only one language, alert emails sent to public servants in only one language. Unfortunately, there are too many examples. One thing is clear. This is not only a major lack of respect. These shortcomings are completely unacceptable because they endanger the population's health and safety in an emergency situation. There will certainly be other emergency situations, but the problems that we have witnessed must not be repeated. In my report, I propose solutions to the federal government to address the recurring problems of communicating with the public in both official languages in crisis situations. Cet automne, le commissariat se penchera de...
This fall, the Commission will be taking a closer look at the public service, specifically at problems with the linguistic identification of positions and at the issue of linguistic insecurity among public servants. In an effort to respond to these issues, my office has already undertaken work in this area, and I will be presenting 2 new reports, along with some new resources and tools based on our findings. Early in my mandate, I set out some long-term priorities for making progress in official languages in Canada. I call these long-term priorities Vision 2025. They focus on ensuring that the Official Languages Act is modernized, the Action Plan for Official Languages achieves its expected outcomes, and federal institutions meet the objectives of the Act. I'm pleased to say that we are making progress on all fronts. Modernization of the Act has been and will continue to be a key focus for my office. My ongoing work with federal institutions and partners on the implementation of the Action Plan for Official Languages has advanced over the past year. And my office created and launched a new innovative tool. It's called the Official Languages Maturity Model, and it shows organizations exactly how their current policies and procedures help them to meet their official languages obligations and where there might be concerns. Approximately 40 federal institutions are participating in the exercise, and 65 federal institutions and other organizations have requested access to the online tool. My office is also paying close attention to other key issues that have a significant impact on official language minority communities. This includes how they are affected by immigration and how they're represented in the media. I plan to engage with you more on these topics in the coming months.
My office's finances. We have a budget of $21.5 million to carry out our mandate during the 2020-2021 fiscal year. This amount includes $15.1 million in salaries, which is nearly 70% of the main estimates. An additional $4.3 million for operating expenses accounts for almost 20% of the main estimates. The remaining $2.2 million, or just over 10% of our main estimates, represents statutory expenditures related to the employer's contributions to employee benefit plans. These funds are in support of my office's mandate, which is carried out through our 3 core responsibilities. The protection of rights related to official languages, which includes investigations, audits, and other compliance activities, as well as legal services. Planned spending in 2021 for this program is $7.5 million, which represents 35% of the total budget. Planned spending for the advancement of French and English in Canadian society in 2021 is $7.1 million, which represents 33% of our total budget. Planned spending for the internal services sector in 2019-2020 is $6.9 million, which represents 32% of our total budget. OCAL's funding does not generally fluctuate greatly from one fiscal year to the next. There was a slight decrease of $0.2 million to the 2021 main estimates compared to last year. This variance is attributable to increased funding received in 2019-20 for the renewal of collective agreements and the use of frozen allotments created over the last years for these collective agreements. Although OCAL has not received additional funding as part of Canada's COVID-19 emergency response measures, our 2021 budget has been impacted by COVID-19. That is, following parliamentary delays related to COVID-19, OCAL, like all other government organizations, has only received 75% of its full supply. We expect to receive full supply for 2020-21 main estimates in December 2020. Comme vous le savez, aucun nouveau financement n'est...
As you know, new funding is not provided for ongoing programs. However, one of the challenges we continue to face as an organization is the number of complaints we receive. Complaints have been on the rise since 2012, from upwards of 400 to more than 1,300. This impacts our ability to conduct audits and studies, as well as to follow up on our investigation recommendations and to liaise with communities and departments. As a result, and because we are committed to using public funds with the utmost integrity, we have developed a culture of continuous improvement. Some measures have already put in place, such as continued investment in information management and information technology, so as to make business processes more efficient and effective. These investments have assisted us in maintaining business continuity throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. That being said, if our budget were to be increased, we would certainly be able to conduct more research, more studies and audits, especially since these activities are often set aside if we need to allocate our resources towards investigating complaints and conducting follow-up to investigations.
If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the official language of your choice, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We will now move to questions. And for 6 minutes, we will have Mr. Blaney and Mr. Dalton. Mr. Blaney, you have the floor. Go ahead, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll accept your invitation to take the floor. First of all, to welcome before us our Commissioner for Official Languages, Mr. Raymond Théberge. Welcome to the Official Languages Committee, the virtual committee. I wish to tell you that you are always welcome before the committee, be it personally, in person, or virtually, as is the case today. And you can count on us. And I wish to thank you for your opening remarks. I hadn't planned on starting off with the issue you mentioned at the end with regard to the budget. I have taken notes here, but I would like to thank you for your opening statement. And were I to summarize what I've just heard, well, you're ringing the alarm bell. You're telling us I did my duty with regard to modernizing the Official Languages Act. The committee has done its homework. I have a letter here from the Federation of Acadians that is asking for modernization of the Act, a letter of the CFA, and you've said that you've asked the Prime Minister to resolve the modernization issue. You stated that it's imperative to modernize the Official Languages Act. What did the Prime Minister say to you? Well, the Prime Minister didn't respond to that recommendation. However, we've had discussions with other parliamentarians, and as you know, during the speech from the throne, there was talk of reinforcing the Official Languages Act. The importance of official languages for our national conversation was underscored. Unfortunately, to date, we haven't had any follow-up after those statements made in the speech from the throne. As you mentioned, parliamentary committees carried out their work. The associations carried out their work. Last year, there were consultations led federally, countrywide. So I believe that we've reached a stage where we must act. And not only myself, but other stakeholders are anxiously awaiting next steps. In other words, when are we going to have an indication from the government as to the next steps? Are we going to have a schedule, a calendar, a parliamentary schedule to bring forward a bill? We're waiting for details. But what I can say is
c'est clair pour nous qu'il y a des lacunes, il y a des failles, et sans remédier à ces lacunes, sans une révision en profondeur de la loi, on va se retrouver effectivement dans la même situation dans 1 an, dans 2 ans, dans 3 ans. Trop souvent, le commissaire se présente devant le comité avec les mêmes questions, les mêmes problèmes. Et je pense que c'est le temps de passer à l'action par le biais d'une loi modernisée.
Bien. Monsieur Tiberge, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation.
Mr. Dalton, thank you very much for your presentation. Last June, the Canadian Supreme Court allocated $7 billion to the British Columbia Francophone School Board. Was it fair for the court to place the blame on the provincial government, or is this a federal role? Answer. I was very pleased with the court's ruling on French education in British Columbia. This is a file over the years that we saw repeating itself and that ended up ultimately before the Supreme Court. The decision was happy news for the Francophone community. My question is, why did it take so many years to arrive at that decision? Education for minority language communities is the responsibility of both provincial governments and, to a certain extent, the federal programs when it comes to second language teaching. To answer your question, the file took so much time to be processed. And this led to losing a generation of young people, so to speak. And it's important to recognize that that has a long-term impact on the community's ability to thrive. And I hope that following this ruling, all levels of government will be able to be proactive to meet the needs and demands of their official language minority communities. Stephen Blaney, less than 1 minute is left, Mr. Commissioner. You said the federal government doesn't promote official languages sufficiently nationally. The federal government has the responsibility of promoting French outside of Quebec and within Quebec. What is your response to that statement? And are you willing to promote French within Quebec? There are only 5 seconds left, Mr. Commissioner. Well, to answer your question simply, in the throne speech, the state of French in Canada was mentioned, and I think we need to seriously look into that question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Dubourg. Mr. Tiberge, could you please switch your sound to the French channel to facilitate interpretation? Yes? Does that work, Madam Clerk? Perhaps Mr. Tiberge should say a few words just to test. I'm always pleased to meet committee members from the Official Languages Committee. Does it work now? Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Tiberge. You're welcome. Thank you very much. Now, I will give the floor to Ms. Lattanzio for the next 6 minutes. Over to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello to everyone.
Tiberge for being amongst us this morning. I've read with great interest your various reports. Of course, the annual report, and took great interest in the one of the impact of the emergency situations on official languages. And I'd like to delve maybe my questions into that particular topic. So because there's also a motion that this committee has presented with regards to the effects of the minority language communities vis-a-vis the services received during the pandemic. So many studies in Canada and elsewhere have looked at language barriers that make it impossible for citizens to communicate with healthcare professionals in their own language. These studies demonstrate the importance of considering the impact of language barriers on the quality of healthcare services for language minority communities. And this situation is even more daunting during a pandemic. So We know that health is an area of jurisdiction that is primarily the responsibility of the provinces and territories. Can you tell us whether or not you have worked with the provinces and territorial language commissioners to ensure their respective governments communicate as effectively as possible with Canadians in minority communities? And if so, what were the results and what else needs to be done in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what we have done so far with respect to, I've had several conversations with my colleagues, namely from New Brunswick and Ontario, where they have commissioners.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I can't hear the commissioner. I have background noises with children. I'm not sure if I'm the only one.
Allez-y, continuez.
Please continue, Mr. Theberge. We'll check on that background noise.
As you mentioned, health is provincial jurisdiction. However, in our report that we issued on security and official languages in emergency situations, we did consult Canadians, and they did indicate to us that it was extremely important that they receive communications in both official languages, irrespective of the level of government. And actually, for many Canadians, it's really hard for them to distinguish which level of government should be providing services. And at the end of the day, for them, what's important is that they receive that information in both official languages, be it from paramedics, be it from governments. So there is an issue around the capacity in many provinces to provide the information in both official languages. So what we did propose in our report is that the various levels of government work together using the expertise that the federal government definitely has in using both languages in these kinds of situations. So the work has to move forward. We still have a lot of work with respect to how we coordinate the work between various levels of government.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a follow-up question. In your report, also, you mentioned that the signing of the most recent protocol for agreements of minority language education and second language instruction 2019-2023. How important is the signing of that protocol? And being from Quebec, I can't help but ask the question: to your knowledge, what were the reasons given by the government of Quebec for not signing such a protocol? Thank you.
I think it's always important that when funds are transferred from one level of government to another, to ensure that with respect to transparency and accountability, that we have a clear idea of where the funds are going. We have no indication as to why the province of Quebec did not sign this agreement. However, it's important moving forward that we have clear criteria for transparency, and that to ensure that the resources that are being are spent meet the objectives that they were meant to meet.
Okay. What would be the deadline? Is Quebec still in a position to be able to sign on, or what is the deadline to be able to sign on to this protocol?
15 seconds, please, Mr. Commissioner.
I'm not aware of any particular date, but I would suspect that one can always sign an agreement.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Theberge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Theberge. Before we move on to the next question from Mr. Beaulieu, I would like to ask the following. Mr. Commissioner, it seems that your software might not be updated. So in fact, that means that every time you switch language, you should click on the bottom of your screen the language in which you are speaking. Actually, the same situation is happening with Ms. Latanzio. So Ms. Latanzio, could you please switch language buttons when you switch the language you are speaking? Now, Mr. Beaulieu has 6 minutes. Over to you. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your presentation. First, quickly, I'd like to say that for 51 years, we have seen that the situation has remained very problematic. Linguistic transfer from Francophones towards English continues to rise. You're sounding the alarm. I think it's important to review the linguistic model on which the Official Languages Act was founded, because it seems there's a blind spot in the Official Languages Act. That is to say, that official language minorities are taken care of by province. In Quebec, the Anglos are the minority community, and Mr. Blaney mentioned this earlier. He said that the throne speech opened our eyes because French is declining in Quebec and English is increasing. Resources for Anglophones are overfunded. Do you think that this should be taken into account in modernizing the Official Languages Act? Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu, for that question, which is certainly relevant. In the throne speech, reference was made to the level of French across the country. There are 8 million Francophones in a country of many more Anglophones. We can agree that French is swimming in a sea of English. When we talk about strengthening the French language, one thing is true. The social contract that now exists because of the Official Languages Act, which was very clearly laid out in 1969, speaks about an Anglophone majority, and a Francophone minority. And the law speaks about respecting minority situation communities. But it's important to strengthen minority languages, and it's important to strengthen French in the context of its minority status across the country. Quite right. And in the throne speech, a connection is drawn as well, because in the 8 million, you have Quebec, and even the United Nations don't recognize Anglos in Quebec as a minority because in Canada, they are a linguistic majority. And it's been difficult to reach an agreement because the Constitution has always been imposed on us that the Quebec government has never signed on to. And this undermines our French Charter of the French language. I'm sure we'll have time to speak about this again. In your report, you give 3 reasons that are 3 major observations. And you say that the government doesn't promote both languages sufficiently countrywide. In Quebec, what does it mean to promote both official languages more?
When we refer to official languages, I also refer to the concept of linguistic duality. And when I refer to linguistic duality, I refer to these 2 majorities. What I'm noting in the last few years is that we're seeing less and less understanding and communication between these two majorities. It's important to understand what Canadian linguistic duality is. It's one of the foundations of our language regime. And the Commission, even if we have a small budget for promotion, we will never be in a position to implement the kind of program which is needed to make all Canadians aware of the importance of duality and the impact of this duality on the Canadian Federation. Excellent. When I was talking about language planning modes, I know I only have a minute left. Thank you, Mr. Thibault. Generally, there are two major models. There's the collective rights and territoriality, and there's, on the other hand, the institutional languages and transportable individual rights, as we see in Canada. Throughout the world, we see institutional bilingualism and not territorial. And that leads to the assimilation of minority languages. And this is what we are seeing happen in Canada. I think the difficulty or the concern, the linguistic concern that we've raised, is that there are fewer and fewer francophones. So it's harder and harder to create an environment which promotes the use of French. So, we'll try now. What are the complaints? This is my last question. You've mentioned, Mr. Beaulieu, what are the Quebec Francophones' complaints? Sorry, I apologize. I'm sorry the Commissioner cannot answer because your time is up. You will be able to come back to it in the next round. And now the floor is over to Madame Ashton for the next 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Theberge, for your work and for your presentation today. Your last report referred to a lot of alarming findings, including communications within the government apparatus and in emergency situations. You raised in the press conference that with the modernized act, this kind of issue would not have had to take place. What is the specific effort that the federal government should do and add into the bill on modernizing the Official Languages Act to ensure that all Canadians can be protected in an emergency situation? Thank you for that question. I'm not going to give a long speech on the modernization of the Act, but specifically in terms of your question, there are two aspects of the Act that are particularly relevant. One is Part 4, communications with services in both official languages, and Part 5, which is the language of work. What we're proposing in the modernization is a review of Part 4. So we address more specifically the idea of an active offer. In other words, to begin a conversation with a signal which indicates that we are ready to answer you in whatever language is of your choosing. In order for this to happen, we have to have a civil service which has a bilingual capacity, enough bilingual staff to be able to meet the demand. So we need to have cohesiveness between Part 4 and Part 5 of the Act. Right now, they aren't necessarily so aligned. When we talk about emergency communications, this is not simply a matter of what we ought to do, it's what we must do. We have to implement mechanisms and necessary procedures so that we have bilingual capacity to be able to respond in emergency situations. So we can, for the time being, make some changes, and this can be done on a spot basis, on an ad hoc basis, but the ideal would be to review the entire law, more specifically Part 4 and Part 5. Thank you very much. You for sharing very clear messages. My next question is on the recent budget cuts in the Alberta government, which will have a major impact on the St. John's campus. There was a whole debate about the French University debate on Toronto and the federal government's role in promoting education in the language of the minority community. is a modernized act with language clauses to promote education in French for minority communities to avoid this kind of cutbacks and promote learning French. When we're talking about the Alberta Saint-Jean campus, this is one example of the importance of institutions in ensuring the vitality of our official languages, minority official language communities. When we talk about the Official Languages Act and we talk about flourishing, vitality of our communities, we often talk about positive steps. We talk about Part 7 of the Act. Part 7 of the Act doesn't have regulations. It's important in our modernization that we add regulations with a preamble that could define the objectives of Part 7. We could better define positive measures. We could talk about key federal institutions because of their impact on community development. We could have a pan-government plan. We absolutely have to implement a consultation mechanism so that we can consult with minority official language communities. In terms of the Saint-Jean campus specifically, what we've heard recently is that there is some openness on the part of the federal government. But we have to protect our institutions because institutions ensure the sustainability of our communities. Thank you. My next question is this. We know that the Liberal government has promised without delivering daycare places for Canadian families. Do you see a role for the federal government in promoting the early childhood education in the minority language? And what impact would a modernized act have with language clauses in achieving this objective? One important element in developing communities is, in fact, this education continuum. When I talk about a continuum, I'm referring to early childhood right up to post-secondary education. Every point of entry is a point at which we can support the development of these communities. When you talk about Part 7 again, it is entirely possible to include in a regulatory framework elements which would specify which factors and vectors of development there are that must be supported. Currently, and of course after the Gascon ruling, Part 7 is limited in application.
So now let's go to the second round. For 5 minutes, we have Mr. Généreux and Mr. Mézeur for 5 minutes. Monsieur Généreux.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. Theberge. I'm very happy to see you again. As you said initially, some of us have been around for longer than others. Can you hear me? Yes, I can. So let's repeat hello. And as you said initially, some of us have been around for longer and some of us less. There's some older and younger ones amongst us on the committee. So here with my friend René, I've been here. So you piqued my curiosity when you talked about the maturity model regarding federal organizations in order to make assessments. You talked about an innovative model to assess. I'd like you to elaborate. I think you have a scale that goes from -10 to +10 because there are a lot of government departments where they might have 0 or minuses in terms of any evaluation of their services being rendered to the Canadian population. Could you tell us a little more about this? Of course. The official language maturity model is a diagnostic tool made available to federal institutions. What we have found is that the vast majority of federal institutions don't know what their strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to integrating official languages into their operations. In other words, we often receive complaints about institutions, and they're talking about implementation of recommendations. but we get the same complaints coming back after the implementation. The way we see it, these federal institutions were not able to integrate official languages into the processes of their organizations. We could be talking about financial services, communications, human resources, whatnot. So this is a tool which is offers a scale from 1 to 5, which enables the federal institutions to self-diagnose where they stand. Very often, federal institutions may be doing fine. And why are they doing fine? Well, because there's a champion. Very often, there's a champion in the institution, and once that person leaves, there's a void. There's no documentation. It's not official. So it's somewhat surprising that after 50 years, we're still in a situation where it really depends on an individual, and rather than having a structure and a formal structure and mechanism within the organization. So the maturity model is a tool which seeks to help the federal institutions better understand where they stand and to equip themselves with a plan. I'm going to go quickly because I may have some other things to say after. You talked about complaints. Now, we know that in the past, there were a lot of complaints regarding Air Canada and airlines. Air Canada lost 95% of its client volume in the last several months. What about the complaints that you're receiving? You said that they're on the rise. What are the complaints about? Well, of course, we're not traveling quite as much this year. We received a lot of complaints. We saw that there was an increase in complaints after communications related to COVID. There was also an increase in complaints in terms of language of work. These are two areas in which there has been an increase in complaints. Of course, even if the traveling public is not affected as much, when Canadians were coming back from abroad in March and April, there were shortcomings in terms of providing information in both official languages. I think that my time is up. Is that so? You have actually 1 minute left. Okay, great. I thought I had to share my time. So getting back to those complaints, you were talking about various areas in which there have been complaints. What encourages me is that if there's an increase in complaints, especially in terms of language at work, that means that Canadian public servants, because we've heard all kinds of horror stories since the spring about all kinds of people who were unable to communicate in the language of their choice in their workplace. Now, of course, we're all on Zoom, so we can understand what this means as a challenge. So it's possible that this challenge can be met, but you're still getting public servants' complaints. If there's an increase in complaints, if I've understood correctly, that means that these people are not shy about reporting these troubling situations. Mr. Tiberge, 10 seconds for your answer, please. I would say that Canadians are very aware of their language rights. And given that they're aware of them, then they take action. Thank you very much. And now the floor is over to Madame Lalonde for the next 5 minutes, please. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Thibault and Mr. Tiberge. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'm a recent addition to this committee, and we've had the opportunity to meet each other in a previous life. So thank you very much for your report. Now, in terms of the report per se, you were mentioning that there were about 100 complaints on official languages during the COVID-19 pandemic.
72 were being investigated. Might you perhaps explain to us how things are progressing with regard to these complaints? Where are we at with regard to these investigations? Well, as you rightly mentioned, we received about 100 complaints. Several of them are admissible. Various complaints are at various stages within the process. It is always difficult to predict when a complaint will be resolved. In other words, there's a preliminary report and then there's a final report. So they are being investigated, these complaints, and given that they're under investigation, I can't say much about them because there is some confidentiality involved. But I can say things are moving forward. And what I also can say is that the number of complaints is quite high because these complaints deal with one issue in particular, one sector, and it demonstrates that in an emergency context, the apparatus isn't necessarily well-tooled to respond to the needs of Canadians in both official languages. As a follow-up, as you know, we're still sadly smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. Several provinces are facing, sadly, very high numbers that all Canadians have been able to witness. Are we expecting further complaints to be made? There will probably be more complaints made. We'll probably receive more. But what happened is that when the pandemic struck, we quickly communicated with all deputy ministers, all leaders of organizations, to remind them of the importance of respecting their obligations with regard to official languages. Also, at the very outset, we directly intervened vis-à-vis several institutions that honestly immediately changed their approach, be it in the context of bilingual press conferences, communications in both official languages with employees. So from the beginning of the pandemic, there have been several improvements. You can see that at the beginning it went up in a marked way, but we flattened the curve there too, as we say. But we'll continue to be receiving complaints because there are so many possibilities. Well, I think we're in a situation where each one of us, we don't know what tomorrow holds, sadly. I would like to move on to something else. I know that we refer to Air Canada, but I would perhaps like to talk to you a little bit more about other complaints mentioned in your report with regard to a lack of bilingual services in airports and at border crossing points for Canadians coming back to Canada during the pandemic. The report outlined several similar problems. Perhaps you could give us more information with regard to the challenges that Canadians sometimes face if they're not able to communicate with federal employees in the official language of their choice, in particular at these border crossings or in international airports, in the situation we're experiencing with this pandemic. The best example might be this. When you land from international travel, you have to isolate for 14 days. That is very clear. So if you only provide information in one official language, let's be clear. We can say that we're bilingual, but we're not all bilingual to the same extent. We're always stronger in one language than in the other. And in a situation of stress, we tend to fall back on our mother tongue. And when you arrive in an airport, if the person isn't able to provide information, there's supposed to be a protocol to assist individuals, but often the protocol isn't followed through with. And with the Transportation Safety Board or with border services, forgive me, Mr. Tiberge, you'll be able to complete your explanation later on. We're out of time for this round. So as I outlined, I'm now giving the floor for 2.5 minutes to Mr. Beaulieu. Go ahead, please. You're muted. Okay, thank you. Quebec is the only place in the country where we can francisize and integrate allophones who arrive in this country, new Canadians, but the linguistic transfers disproportionately favor English, Anglophones, which threatens French in Quebec. In order to achieve our objectives, we're trying to make French the common language. If new arrivals see that French is the common language while respecting the rights of the English minority, well, they will tend to acquire better knowledge of the French language and better integrate Quebec society. But the federal government says, no, French isn't the official language. It's both languages, and you choose the one you want. And English is the majority language elsewhere in Canada. What do you think of that situation? Well, this is a question that leads one to reflect upon various things, given that we've got two official languages in Canada, and they're the two official languages for our national conversation. To be admitted to Canada, if I'm not mistaken, you must speak one or the other of the two official languages of the country. And it's up to the individual to choose this language. In our present system, that's our reality. If we're going to be discussing changes in this regard, well, perhaps some of your remarks would have an impact. But clearly, immigration for Francophones outside Quebec, as an example, well, it's critical, it's essential for their survival. We can increase the number of Francophones, that's what we see, but their proportion is constantly dropping. Yes, if we accept more Anglophones that are more and more anglicized, there won't be an impact. Just one final question, Mr. Chairman. No, Mr. Beaulieu, forgive me, but 2.5 minutes flies by. So I now move to Ms. Ashton for 2.5 minutes, please. Ms. Ashton. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Theberge, based on the government's open data, in 2020, you had offers for translation services with 17 businesses. You indicated that it takes a central translation agency available in emergency situations. Do you think that departments should have to call upon this central service at all times for translation? There is a translation bureau, but the Translation Bureau today... Sorry, that was my second question, says Mr. Beaulieu. The Translation Bureau must work on a cost-to-recovery basis. So some federal institutions go outside the government to seek out translation services. I believe that when we're talking about certain specific situations, for example, emergency situations, we should have in place a translation service that is quick, that would be delivered by the Translation Bureau, and this is a recommendation that we made. And I do believe that it's extremely important that the Translation Bureau have the necessary resources to carry out its work. Thank you. My next question is with regard to complaints. How many days, according to you, does it take before an investigation is undertaken after the tabling of a complaint? It varies tremendously depending on the analysis that we do with regard to the admissibility of complaints. In some cases, it's immediate. In other cases, we even must seek out legal advice to determine if the complaint is admissible. So it varies, but I can say that we can advise the complainant quite quickly as to the admissibility or not of the complaint. Might you tell us, does it take more time than in the past? We're talking about the oldest complaints. Do you know how far back they go? The oldest complaints? I would prefer to call upon Ms. Sakeley to know which complaints are the oldest. It's probably one complaint. I don't know. Perhaps she could help me. Thank you, Mr. Theberge. Ms. Sakeley might intervene later on. So now the final round, 5 minutes for the Vice Chair, Mr. Blaney. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Commissioner Theberge, Pandemic and official languages, it's not a good mix, as you stated. It accentuated the chronic problems that already existed. You talk about 72 plaints that were deemed admissible, and the public health officials held press conferences in French only. We had communications in English only. You're saying that it wasn't the first time in an emergency situation that the French language is being set aside in an emergency situation in Canada. We know that the pandemic is having a greater impact with the elderly who aren't necessarily bilingual. You've sought to defend them, but have you seen improvements during the course of the pandemic that we're experiencing now? You are proposing measures to be put in place, and I would like to hear you. How might we draw lessons from this unfortunate experience that we're undergoing now? As I mentioned earlier, we intervened vis-à-vis certain institutions, and there has been an improvement. There have been improvements. We can say that. However, we do not have in place the necessary structures in order for this type of situation to not repeat itself. We're talking about organizations, preparation for emergencies, and some players are not prepared. We must have in place the necessary processes and structures in order to be able to develop immediately the bilingual capabilities of these institutions. Let's go back 10 years. For 10 years, the same type of incidents have been occurring. So it's important that the federal institutions more impacted upon by emergencies, we know them, public safety, etc. We know who they are, and they must be properly tooled. The employees of these institutions must be equipped so as to be able to respond in emergency situations. It's too late to learn French during an emergency. And that's the major problem, a lack of preparation. Thank you. I would like to share my time with Mr. Major, Mr. Chairman. Yes, with pleasure, Mr. Major. You have the floor. Please turn your microphone on.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Good information here. I see you have 5 regional offices. Whereabouts are they in the country? And I have more of a question. I'm phoning from Manitoba. Dauphin Swan River Neepawa is the riding, just by Brandon, straight north of Brandon. So how do you communicate with these rural communities that are basically isolated, the St. Lazare, St. Rose, in emergency situations and just day to day? Is there something in these regional offices where communities can interact and build more awareness, not only for the French communities that are there, but also to help the English communities support those communities that are out in the isolated areas? Do you offer any services out of those regional offices?
Yes. Actually, I'm currently sitting in Winnipeg. So I know Manitoba really well, just to let you know. So our regional services offer a number of services to the official language minority community in the provinces, in their provinces, whether it's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. So we have offices in Moncton, in Montreal, in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Edmonton, and we have branch offices also in Vancouver, in Sudbury, and Toronto. Now, we help bring together, for example, federal institutions which are, for example, local, provincial, that are situated in the province, and we bring them together with the communities to have a better kind of interaction. For example, when we look at border security, we try to encourage border services to communicate with the official languages community to try to have access to bilingual staff, for example. And we do a lot of presentations in schools, not only French schools, but French immersion schools, to explain, to promote official languages. And we work closely with federal institutions to be able to meet the needs of for example, those rural communities that you're talking about, whether it's Saint Lazare or Saint Rose, or the case may be.
Just as a follow-up, could we get a report on what schools you're actually going to, and who's taking that up? Who's taking that information up?
Sure. So right now we're not doing a lot of schools right now, but we can give you some past records.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you for your contribution today. It's greatly appreciated.
As you said, it's important for us to turn the tables. And thank you very much. For the next 5 minutes, I have Mr. Arsenault to end the first round. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Such interesting questions and answers from my colleagues and from our dear Commissioner. Commissioner, I want to dive right back into the modernization of the OLA. I have just a few minutes, but you identified in your report the 3 pillars that you think are important. You also touched on the same problems, which we have all already, we've looked into your report. You think there should be more binding power to better enforce the law. We understand your position, but I do feel opposed to this 3rd pillar of yours. I do feel against what we heard from the Commissioner, Michel Carrier. In New Brunswick, and also the Ontarian Commissioner told us quite the opposite. He said we should be less binding but more specific in our enforcement of the OLA. Could you please speak to this? Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. Well, when it comes to compliance mechanisms, which were, as you say, part of the 3rd pillar, they must be robust. Since the Office of the Commissioner was created, we have received 50,000 complaints. And the results they gave were the results they gave. The Office of the Commissioner has significant investigative power. And we have the power to make recommendations. And even if our recommendations are carried out at, say, a rate of 80%, that does not help us to change institutions' behaviors. And that is why we judged it necessary to develop compliance mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms. For example, punitive sanctions, but there are many other options that could be considered. I think that at this point in time, we should seriously question how much bite this law has. But Mr. Commissioner, we received witness accounts from the new Official Languages Commissioner from Wales. He had a 7-year mandate, and he was on the last year of his mandate. I believe you followed his witness account as well. And it's interesting to compare our 2 countries. She was telling us how she could be subtle and coercive and succeed in persuading her institutions and her government to comply. She spoke to a model that was hybrid. She is commissioner and ombudsman, and she does have those powers. It's important to distinguish the role of ombudsman from commissioner. The commissioner must be impartial and nonpartisan. All mechanisms proposed must take that into account and must also ensure that what is proposed really and truly responds to complainants' needs. Most of our complainants expect for us to deal with their complaints. However, when it comes to institutions who are uncooperative, we must find ways, whether it's through an agreement or through legal tools, to achieve better compliance. This law has been in place for decades. In the various reports tabled, different enforcement mechanisms are mentioned, and I think it's important for us to reflect on them. And we need to achieve a law that is robust enough. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Chair, you said I have 30 minutes left, is that right? No, I think we'll stop there. You have 10 seconds left, but I think it's better for us to stop right there. That was a great discussion on the Commissioner's annual report. In the next panel, we will speak about his 2020-2021 budget. It is already 12:20, and our time is limited. So for the second round, I would say that we should have the 6-minute round for each party. Because this discussion will be important to table before the House of Commons. So first we'll have Mr. Généreux and Messier. So over to you, Mr. Généreux. Thank you, Mr. Chair. René alluded to the law, to the act rather, and to Wales. We were very impressed by the witness account at the time. As you know, Commissioner, I have always been strongly against any type of sanctioning through any type of court or tribunal. However, I increasingly observe that even within the federal system, and I see this and I'm wondering if in your maturity model, there might be a way to deal with public servants. For example, they could receive incentives for their bilingualism, so in the form of a bonus. The maturity model leads to institutions self-assessing their bilingualism. Would it be possible to put certain restrictions in place to make it so that public servants need a certain level of bilingualism in order to receive bonuses? Could we go at it from a cause and effect angle? Answer. What's difficult is that the maturity model doesn't look at individuals, it looks at the whole system of a federal institution. It's at a systemic level within an organization. I think it would be difficult for that type of model to lead to that type of conclusion. I think what needs to change is the organization's culture. It's important to put the necessary structures in place to respect official languages. Official languages need to be integrated. All too often, the official languages lens is not applied to federal institutions, but it is very important to do so. So that is the objective of the maturity model. That is to say, to assess federal institutions. So it is the MMLO, the maturity model for official languages? Yes. We maybe should apply the maturity model to the committee, but I think we would pass because we do great work. Commissioner, you spoke about your financial needs earlier. I'd like to come back to it quickly. Do you have an assessment of what needs you might have to do even more elaborate work? Answer. We did not look into that question yet. Why? Well, simply because we are able to respect our mandate. But we did start reflecting on what the impact of our funding is. As I said, we are doing more work on investigations, which takes away our resources for research. We must also follow up on recommendations and monitor their application, because otherwise it isn't very worthwhile to make the recommendations in the first place. Recently, we published documents on official languages in emergency situations. Yesterday, we published one on Section 91. It is important for us to understand certain aspects, and I think it's important for us to look into those. For example, right now we are preparing a report for the new year on immigration. If we had more resources, we would use it on research, and this would inform our recommendations, and it would be useful to inform the government. Mr. Dalton. Thank you, Mr. Tiberge. I'd like to continue with Mr. Mazier's question. You have 5 regional offices across Canada. One in Edmonton serves Alberta, the territories, BC, and has a Vancouver liaison office to serve some 5 million people. Do you think that is sufficient to serve such a big population in BC? Answer. When we look at Alberta and BC, we know that these are 2 provinces where official language minority communities are growing as concerns their population. And we would like to have more resources to serve this large territory. We identified certain needs, and I think we will be able to meet those needs of those communities. If we carry out more analyses and we find that the needs are greater, we will need further resources. The offices have various roles. They must at once promote the languages and also support the communities. And of course, these people in these offices are extremely, extremely busy. Thank you very much, Mr. Tiberge. Now I will give the floor to Ms. Lambropoulos for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much, Mr. Tiberge, for your presentation in the committee today and for answering our questions.
To ask my questions, and they aren't necessarily on the estimates, but I'll try to link it back and see what you can tell me about how we can, on what kinds of funding we can put in place in order to make sure that you can do the job that you need to do for both official language minority communities. So my first question actually comes from an English-speaking group in Quebec that had a question about the summary on your official languages summit that you provided that was held last November to celebrate 50 years of the Act. At this summit, there were discussions among young people, one of which caught the group's interest. People sometimes have an outdated view of official language communities. For example, the economic status of English-speaking Quebecers is much lower than what is commonly held as a stereotype. What do you think that your office can do to dispel of myths such as these that make the English-speaking minority community seem wealthier than it is and seem like the pampered minority?
That's an excellent question, and we have shared data. We have data with respect to that question, and we have shared the data with a number of institutions. I think what's important is, and I've met with many members of the English-speaking minority in Quebec, and there is an outdated perception of what the community is about. I met researchers who deal with, for example, single-income families in NDG, for example, who basically
these people
do not at all look in terms of what the perception is. There's a lot of work that has to be done. I've met with various people there is also the the Secretariat in Quebec City, which has some of that information. Incumbent upon us to always clarify these points when we meet institutions or groups, to make them perfectly clear that perception that you have is very outdated. But we have data to support that.
I think it's a dangerous perception, considering the talks that are being had in Quebec at the moment with regards to French in the workplace and all of this. We know that the English-speaking community has a much higher unemployment rate because it's much more difficult to find work if you don't speak French completely fluently within the province of Quebec. And so as much as we're talking about increasing the level of French across Canada and even in Quebec, I'd like to know what you think ways that we can do this would be without stepping on the rights of the minority community and without, while still protecting the rights that English-speaking Quebecers have.
When I look at the English-speaking minority in Quebec, what I see today is what I call is a young minority. It's a minority that does not have in place a lot of the social infrastructure that similar communities would have outside of Quebec. For example, youth organizations, organizations dealing with seniors. They don't have necessarily the research capacity within these organizations to put forward their case, and actually in the action plan for until 2023, there are some dollars for the English-speaking minority in Quebec to develop that social infrastructure capacity, which is not there. And I think it's really about maintaining institutions. We talk a lot about the institutions that they have. It's all about maintaining them to make sure that it's cultural, it's educational, it's health. So those institutions have to be maintained. So how do we do that? There's a role for various levels of government to do that. But I think fundamentally, we seem to be sometimes at odds with how we can best support the English-speaking minority in Quebec, because it goes back to your first question. If we don't perceive the problem in the right way, we can't come up with the right kinds of solutions.
Thank you. Another question that I have along the same lines is we hear, I don't want to call it a myth. I'll give the benefit of the doubt. We hear that the French language is declining in Quebec. I've heard that on several occasions. I have to see proof in order to believe that. But we've seen it on several occasions that people do have this conception. In your view, do you think that it is due to the workplace, or do you think that it's due to other issues such as perhaps entertainment, perhaps the social aspect of things? What exactly do you think contributes to this decline of French in Quebec?
What I would say with respect to any language, it's more than the workplace, it's more than the schools. You live your life in a linguistic environment. There are many factors that impact that linguistic environment. Which ones can you actually control and which ones can you not control? I think what we have to look at is what are those factors that are having an impact, a significant impact on this question. And I think we can look at it in terms of whether it's French in Quebec or French in Manitoba. There are a lot of factors that come into play, be they cultural, be they economic. It doesn't matter. There's a whole slew of factors that impact on the evolution of language in society.
Merci, Monsieur Théberge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Théberge. And now the floor is over to Mr. Beaulieu for the next 6 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Beaulieu. Unmute your microphone, please. Okay, can you hear me? Yes, very well. We hear you very well. Great. So, well, you're talking about there being a perception about English speakers being outdated. I don't agree with you. We know that English language institutions are overfunded, whether we're talking about primary schools or high schools, based on the demographic weight of Anglophones. Higher education is generally 3 times more funded than the English-speaking population, whereas in the rest of Canada, it's the reverse. The French language institutions are underfinanced and underfunded based on the demographic weight of Francophones. In terms of the highest unemployment rates, it's the allophones who only speak French. They're the ones who are most highly penalized by the decline of French. All this to say is, do you think it's relevant? Because right now, since Francophone Quebecers are considered to be a majority, they're never consulted. All of the advocacy and French language promotion organizations are excluded. They've been excluded from Madame Joly's major consultations, and unless they were considered in the National Capital Region. So don't you think that this would be a good time to consult the researchers and advocacy groups who work for the French language in Quebec? I'd like to refer to the comments made in the speech from the throne. When we're talking about the state of French in a Canadian context and North American context, I think that the findings of the federal government should lead us to think about what are the next steps, what ought we to do next, so as to ensure that French continues all across the country. Now, of course, in Quebec, on their territory, they have already implemented various means to achieve this. But the question is this. It's important, what is most important is to have French continue to exist in Canada. But in the speech from the throne, we have to hear what's the next step? How do we implement? How can we make concrete what is being put forth? Well, it'll be interesting conversations. So you were saying, okay, after 51 years, you're sounding the alarm. There are all kinds of difficulties. If we look at the demographics, things aren't going well. But your budget has remained the same. Do you find that logical? Shouldn't your budget be increased if we want to change things? And where would it be best to increase your budget? What's interesting with the Commission's budget is that we have to keep our mandate in mind. It would be good to have additional resources for research and for studies and audits. But the Commissioner of Official Languages is a small organization. We're not here to be substitutes. If we want to really implement a promotion program or a program for the advancement of languages, it's not the Commission that's going to be able to do it with our few employees. Sometimes, and too often, we offer services instead of other federal institutions. We give trainings on how to manage bilingual meetings. That shouldn't be done by us. It should be done by the Public Service Commission School. It should be done by the federal institutions that have the means to do it. So we have to be careful of remembering what our mandate is and what the best way of fulfilling our mandate is. Last question. You said there's $7.5 million for investigations and audits. Does that also include more substantial investigations? For example, in New Brunswick, there is a request for special status because there's the principle of where numbers justify, and so there's a question of limiting French services. Is this the kind of research that could be undertaken, or has it already been done? Well, we have already done a lot of research on compliance. Since legal affairs are part of that budget, that department has already carried out a lot of legal studies in many areas. In terms of advancement and promotion, that's on the research and policy side. If there's an issue such as immigration or security, often the lead will be that directorate. But when we're talking about Section 91, the Legal Services Department is the one who's involved. And we often have access to specialists who are specialists in the law outside the Commission. But it's clear that with the research budget that we're bigger, if we were to have more resources, we would be able to carry out more research, do more studies, and then we don't want to remove funding from investigations and audits. Thank you very much, Mrs. Theberge-Beaulieu. And now, Mrs. Ashton, the floor is yours for the next 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, in the Official Languages Act modernization process, can you tell us what additional powers you need to be able to ensure that the instructions that you give would be respected? Could you tell us what compliance mechanisms and accountability should be strengthened so that all federal institutions would finally respect their obligations when it comes to language obligations? Thank you for that question. In our position paper, we refer to two kinds of compliance mechanisms. We talked about monetary penalties, administrative monetary penalties, and there is some complementarity. You can sign binding agreements, and if the agreements are not respected, then there could be administrative monetary penalties. I'd like to mention that when you talk about sanctions, we would like to create a linguistic duality fund. So the fund would be used for perhaps promoting research on linguistic duality or promoting it. So those are two mechanisms. There are others, of course, which are available to framers of the legislation, but we have identified those two mechanisms for compliance. Thank you for that. My next questions are on the complaints issue. I don't know if your colleague is still available to answer. I'd like to ask what proportion of cases where the complaint processing times, what's the complaint processing times for where there's processes has not been respected? I don't know whether Mrs. Sakely could answer that. I was prepared to answer your first question. Well, go ahead as you wish. We'd like to have answers to both questions. So in terms of the oldest files under investigation, they date back to 2017. We have only 2 cases dating back to 2017, which are currently still being investigated. They are extremely complex cases, and we are moving it forward as quickly as we can. There are also various files from 2018, about 30 of those. The others are much more recent. I can tell you that all files receive all the necessary attention from our staff. Complainants are always contacted quickly, and they are kept abreast of the process of inquiry. Of course, there are many steps in any investigation, and there are a lot of steps that are out of our control. For example, when we ask for information from a federal institution, unfortunately, it could take a certain amount of time before they give us an answer and before they answer us satisfactorily so that we can examine all of the issues. So I don't know whether that answers your question. I don't have an actual percentage before me in terms of what's the service standards that we have given ourselves and are we respecting it. But of course, it depends on the volume of complaints we receive.
As Mr. Theberge explained, over the past 5 years, we've been receiving 3 to 5 times more complaints than 5 years earlier. So the higher the volume is, clearly, the more difficulty we have in taking care of these complaints and respecting compliance. How many complaints haven't been referred to investigators, and on average, how many complaints are sent to an investigator. This work is done very quickly, as Mr. Theberge explained earlier. We always must analyze a complaint when we receive it. We have to determine if it's admissible or not. Usually this work is done quickly, but in some cases, indeed, we must ask for legal advice to our legal services team, and that takes a little bit more time. But usually, the complaints are referred quickly to an investigator, and the investigator communicates with the parties as quickly as possible. Advance notice is sent forward, and we communicate with the complainants, but that's where the investigation begins, and we can't necessarily tell how long it will take because it depends on the volume, on the complexity of the files. As far as workloads go as well, it varies greatly depending on the complexity of the case. Some investigators are responsible for certain institutions or organizations where there might be a higher workload, caseload, but there are strategies that are developed in order to assess more files, but it's difficult to respond. I can't give you a precise number of files per investigator, unfortunately. Talking about this, I can understand that you're unable to give a precise number, but might you give us an idea of the areas where there are a greater number of complaints? Institutions that receive the most are all those institutions that deal directly with Canadians. Mr. Theberge mentioned, I think earlier, institutions that relate to, that deal with travelers, the Border Services Agency, airport authorities, the Air Transport Safety Board. These are the institutions that generate the most complaints, perhaps, but we do receive all sorts of complaints regarding a great number of federal institutions. But the major categories are federal institutions that deal daily with the public, with Canadians. Border Services, as I mentioned, Revenue Canada, Public Works. Thank you, Ms. Sakeley. Listen, thank you, Ms. Ashton. We have a last round, colleagues. So 5 minutes to begin with Mr. Blaney, 5 minutes with Mr. Arsenault, 2.5 minutes for Mr. Beaulieu, and 2.5 minutes with Ms. Ashton. And then we'll move to the vote. Mr. Blaney, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, 2 questions. The first one, you mentioned the fact that your budget is limited, and the pandemic saw a tripling of the number of complaints. So is your present budget preventing you from achieving your full mandate? We're talking about modernization, where we might see a broadening of your mandate. Do you have concerns in that area? And with regard to modernization, and in the context of today's discussion, my question is this. Immigrants, are you doing a follow-up as to the number of immigrants who don't master one of the 2 official languages? And is this a concern for you? Thank you. With regard to your first question, I'm of the view that if our modernization is pursued, if it becomes a reality, and if we take into account the recommendations I have made with regard to modernization, then clearly this will create new needs within our organization. No matter, that's clear-cut. In that context, we'll have to prepare a submission to Treasury Board. With regard to your second question, to my knowledge, we don't do follow-up vis-a-vis immigrants, if I understand your question correctly, immigrants who aren't learning one or the other of the 2 official languages. We have a number we use. When we distribute a bilingual message, 98% of Canadians understand it. Commissioner, I was a teacher here in BC in the public education system. I was a teacher for several years, and I remember every year the process to be followed by parents who wanted to register their children in French immersion classes. These parents had to go to the school early in the morning, and sometimes they had to camp out during the night to register their children and to be sure that these precious spots would be accessible to their children. One of my daughters started out in immersion and went to Simon Fraser in the French Corps program. My second daughter was 42nd, and there were only 40 spots available, so it was impossible for her to access these services. Do you think that this situation is acceptable? And what should we do? I know that education is a provincial jurisdiction, but the federal government does have a responsibility with regard to learning both official languages and French outside of Quebec. Well, the situation that you describe is not unique, no matter where you are in Canada. The popularity of immersion programs is such that for the last 5 years, we've seen a 20% increase in the number of students registered last year. I launched a research project on the shortage of teachers in French as a second language. We launched this in Vancouver, because Vancouver is a city where immersion is extremely popular. Immersion is popular throughout the country, so there is a shortage of teachers. That's the first thing, the first limiting factor. Secondly, at the school board level, people often seek to limit registrations. In some areas, there's a lottery for assigning spots as seats in these classes. To my mind, our mandate supports the teaching of French as a second language. Funds have been set aside to counter this shortage in French as a second language. What is extremely important is this: we mustn't ever forget the role of a province in the area of education. And it's important that each student receive an education funded by the province. And if there are additional costs, and often times it's the additional costs that are subsidized via education agreements. I believe that the challenge for Canada is this: if we are not able to ensure quality training in a second language, this has an impact that we see. The bilingualism rate hasn't greatly increased over the last 7 or 8 years. We have to find bilingual employees, staff, be it within the federal government and Air Canada. There's an immense need for bilingual employees, and I think all of this is a matter of education, and we must determine what is the best way to support education in a second language. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Arsenault, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the second hour is for the budget, well, I have questions, but I do have questions about the modernization of the Official Languages Act. So I'm going to let myself be tempted a second time. Commissioner, might you take 2 little minutes to talk to you about what you're seeing with regard to the priorities, the positive measures? What might these positive measures be, the ones you allude to concretely? When we talk about positive measures, well, it's a case that we've already experienced. When we talk about, for example, an agreement with the media, we should ensure that in the context of that kind of agreement, we take into account the needs of the community. There must be consultation with the community affected. What must be included in the agreement to support the communities? This could also be an issue with immigration. There could be specific elements that could be included in an immigration policy to enhance Francophone immigration. As an example, sometimes things are done in a haphazard way. And Part 7, at present, given that we have the Gascon decision, you're a lawyer, so you're familiar with this. Any measure can be seen as a positive measure, so we really have to have a clear and precise definition outlining what this means for an institution to have positive measures vis-à-vis the community. An element that often is lacking is consultation with the community. Thank you very much. I'll come back now to the estimates. In your preamble, before you started answering our questions in your remarks, you talked about a total budget of 21.5 million. So that's the total budget that encompasses everything, salaries, operations. But just underneath, you say it's about a third with regard to the protection of rights related to official languages. Are we talking about the same funds or of different funds? No, it's 21 million. And it includes everything. Taxes too. Tax included. That's the amount. Tax included. Okay. So I see here you explain that you've got three core responsibilities: protection of rights, advancement of French and English in Canadian society, and internal services, with a one-third split, roughly. And you say that for 2020-2021, only 75% of the budget was obtained because of the pandemic. Did I understand correctly? To date, but we're going to be getting the remaining 25%. So you're going to survive. Oh, yes. We'll get through this. You'll get through it. Hypothetical question for you. In your proposals for administrative tribunals, hypothetically, have you reviewed what the budget might be in the best possible conditions for modernizing the Act based on your recommendations? We haven't allotted amounts. It's very difficult to conceive of an organization given the little we know about the future, what the future will be. If I'm told, Mr. Temerge, your 10 top recommendations are going to be implemented, then I can get down to work. But for the time being, it is clear that if we get rules for Part 5, if we get a framework for Part 7, clearly this will add tasks to our list. But it's too early to predict. Very well. I see that I have about 30 seconds left. If for the current year, for the credits to be voted later, if you had a recommendation to make, hypothetically, yet again, what would it be? Because we're in a pandemic, but what would that recommendation be? I believe it would be important that we have the opportunity to review our operations and most probably to submit a project, some project to Treasury Board, for example. And I must underscore the fact that we don't fund current programs. These must be new programs. So I think we'll have to reflect upon this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Theberge. So for the next 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. So, indeed, it's difficult to stick just to the budget, to the estimates, but you say that the planned spending for the advancement of French and English in Canadian society is 7.1 million for 2020-2021, 33% of our budget. Could you give us examples? Does this include promotion of official languages? Could you give us examples specifically as to what this might represent in Quebec?
Concretely, when we talk about promotion, usually that is regional bureau offices that do this in schools. So we have our Montreal office that goes around to schools and immersion schools and gives presentations. It also works with the federal board and will visit, for example, different Quebec regions such as the northern region to isolated communities. And the same thing happens in other provinces, in Manitoba and so forth. What we want to try to do now is be able to speak more to the majority. That's what we want to do through our recommendations. Earlier, we spoke about promotion and linguistic duality, and now it is just as important to speak to the majority as the minority, because often we find ourselves just speaking to ourselves, but we need to speak to the others as well. And we also carry out research projects. As I said, we have one coming up on immigration. We have another one on Section 91. Our research helps us to identify themes and problems, and then we can formulate a prescription for that or a recommendation. We also set up kiosks at conferences, and we're always trying to understand linguistic duality. Mr. Beaulieu, so in Quebec, you would promote more services in English, is that right? About 30 seconds remaining, Commissioner. Oh, actually, we have 15 seconds left, Mr. Beaulieu, so a quick answer, please. We promote official languages and we promote linguistic duality. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Ms. Ashton, you will be able to ask the final questions to Mr. Theberge for 2.5 minutes. Over to you. Thank you very much. Commissioner, the Federation of Francophone and Acadian Communities published recommendations, and I'd like to touch on one that we brought up today. The absence of a central government agency to enforce the Official Languages Act makes it possible for different institutions to pass the responsibility on elsewhere. What do you think is important in enforcing the law? Answer. We are very conscious of the fact that this is an act of which the enforcement is a shared responsibility. Part 7 is the responsibility of Canadian heritage, for example, and the responsibility must be well coordinated. I would say it is clear that there's a need for a central agency. I think a thought should be given to that. In 2003, a report was published, and Mr. Stéphane Dion was the Minister of Official Languages, and he had a committee of deputy ministers that looked into the Official Languages Act. I think that the need to share the responsibility isn't working very well in the system. It's important to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of different agencies to make sure that the OLA is enforced properly, and to ensure also that when problems arise, they are dealt with swiftly. We must ensure proper governance of the Official Languages Act. Ms. Ashton, thank you for that. I have a question on managing complaints. What do you need to be able to protect and promote official languages in Canada? What? Inaudible for the interpreter. Did you hear me? I missed the last part. Your internet connection was cutting out, but I think the commissioner understood the gist. Actually, yes, it's my internet connection. That's the reality in our region. So what would a tribunal look like, was my question. Answer. Our vision of the tribunal is still evolving, but I think it should respect 3 principles. Firstly, the tribunal should ensure that it really and truly gives access to justice. Would it be a better system than what is in place currently. It really must meet the needs of complainants. Secondly, the tribunal must maintain the independence and the role and the impartiality of the ombudsman. And thirdly, the tribunal must rule on points of law. For example, penalties and so on. But our vision is evolving, and we are working on an upcoming document on that. Thank you very much, Mr. Tiberge. Please stay with us for a few more minutes. I would now like to ask committee members to vote on this credit. So, pursuant to Standing Order 81.4, the main estimates for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2021 were deemed referred to the several standing committees of the House as follows. Main estimates 2020-2021, vote 1, under Commissioner of Official Languages. Shall vote 1, under Commissioner of Official Languages, carry? Is anyone opposed? I see no one opposed. So, vote 1 under Commissioner Official Languages is carried.
2020-2021 to the House of Commons. Are there any objections? Voilà. Donc, merci.
Thank you. I will report the main estimates to the House. On behalf of all committee members, I would now like to thank the Commissioner and his whole team. So thank you, Mr. Tiberge, for coming to see us, along with Mr. Lebuc, Ms. Saïkale, Mr. Trépanier, and Mr. Giguère. It was wonderful to hear you, and committee members hope to see you again soon. On that note, dear colleagues, I adjourn the sitting. Thank you very much.